Hello, my friends. No regular video this week, I'm afraid, because I have recently, and you've probably heard me say this a lot over the past few months, started a new job. But the difference is that this one is an actual full-time position, so I'm significantly busier than I have been. And switching from being self-employed to being regular employed has been kind of a weary journey, but we're making it work, and I'm actually rather liking my new position. It's just going to take me some time to switch over from the sort of pacing that I had set for myself before to fitting what my production process is into the schedule of my new job. So fear not, I'm still going to meet that one video a week quota that I've been setting for myself, and I've been pretty darn good about it, except maybe around the holidays. But I did watch a lot of anime over the past few weeks. I've been taking on this new strategy of watching the English dubs while playing video games so that I can feel more productive, multitasking, that fun business. Unfortunately, all the shows that I watched didn't really turn out to have enough substance for me to want to make a regular episode on it. So I thought I would just write down my thoughts about all of them and sort of just tell you them one by one. And I even made an outline. All right. The first anime that I watched was called Z-Man. It was a show about rich people who made a bunch of bug monsters to fight in an arena for their own amusement. But then the bug monsters got loose and they were hiding amongst the populace and started killing people. And the hero was one of these bug monsters, and the other protagonist was some kid who grew up with a bunch of money and wanted to become a hero because he idolized his Sentai heroes on television. The premise isn't really what matters, but what the show attempted to get at was a message about the impediments to altruism. However, where it fell flat was in its presentation of the main character essentially not having a definition of what altruism was, because he was just being good for goodness sake, doing it by feeling it out, and just so happened to want to help people, and never made any mistakes in how he did it. Whereas the second protagonist said he wanted to help people and to be a hero, but it was in engaging with him that the impediments started showing themselves. Well, that's not entirely true. The main character showed that his main impediment to helping people was survival. Being able to make money and survive in the society that he was born in made it hard for him to help people, so he charged people after he saved them. For the second protagonist, who wanted to be the hero, the Sentai hero, the main thing that was getting in his way was pride and selfishness. He was doing good for the sake of being lauded, for being idolized. And that sort of stemmed from a situation in which he was being praised for being a hero of another terrible situation in their past, which the first protagonist was actually responsible for and didn't get any credit because he wasn't from a rich, popular family. The series did the standard challenge of presenting altruism as being good without any kind of self-benefit whatsoever, as in, even if you did what was good without selfish motives, if you benefited from it, you would therefore not be altruistic. And it tried to make that assertion through a series of challenges to the deontological idea of altruism, with the utilitarian sacrifice, challenges. And ultimately, it collapsed because the big evil guy who was creating these challenges for the main characters had his definition of justice devolve from It devolved from practical utilitarian argument into some odd notion of truth or justice needing to be objective, but the objectiveness was defined in just abject sacrificing of people, which isn't really what utilitarian arguments or challenges are meant to achieve. And then that same character, that same bad guy that was creating these utilitarian challenges to the main characters, kind of just said, oh, it needs to be objective. By the way, my motivations are entirely based in my revenge. So, in exactly the same scene, they completely deconstructed the tool that they had been using to create an interesting argument about altruism and lost it, which is why I don't really feel like the show warranted much more exploration, because its message collapsed in on itself and it didn't really have a satisfactory ending. It sort of just decided to jump that ship, get all the characters that were having that conversation killed off, and set the main character on the end of his journey to fight what he needs to fight and then get the girl in the end. Ultimately, the only character in the show that has any interest in simply doing good is the main character, Gene, Zetman, because he's only motivated by wanting to do good and nothing beyond that. The small characters around him, the family characters around him, also are motivated by that same thing, but they ultimately don't have much of an impact in the story other than being a damsel in distress or being someone to talk up the main character while basically handing out food to the homeless to demonstrate that, oh, look, these are good people trying to help people, which would be fine if they didn't use that exact scene every single time. All the other characters in the show have no interest in attempting to do good and don't even believe themselves really to be doing good. They just are doing what they want. And I think that's an unrealistic portrayal of people, because people think that they're doing good when they take any action. Even if they're wrong, they usually think they're on the side of right. The next show that I watched was Zegapane, and it was a mecha sci-fi anime about essentially humans, the human world being destroyed. Humans are treated into computers by making digital copies of themselves, and sort of took on a very haphazard attempt to wrestle with the concept of whether digital minds can count as people or can count as real. When presented with the option of finding a way to fight out of and leave that digital space to become real people again, they kind of explored the hedonist imperative a bit, of some people saying, well, I'd rather stay in this simulation so that I can enjoy my life and what I have here, because there's none of those modern conveniences in the outside world, in the real world. But I think that kind of breaks down, because the whole point of the hedonist imperative is to create progress by motivating people positively. But the setup of this universe is that the world itself has to reset every year so that they don't build up too much data and run out of room on the server that the digital human brains are being stored on. It also mixes in a little bit of a solipsism, the idea that what you think about the world can actually define the world, but doesn't really get into it. It's sort of just like a throwaway line in a couple episodes, but it's completely unexplored. What was most interesting about this show was that it found a very unique way of expressing the challenges of depression, because one of the characters sort of got stuck in between being projected in the real world and being digital in the computer server world they had made for themselves, where on one side she couldn't feel any emotions, but still had to live through a day-to-day life. Then on the other side, she remembered everything and could feel emotions for those memories retroactively. And it was interesting because it sort of gave a voice to the suffering that one can experience in depression through a very emotional rather than I guess an emotional expression that people who haven't experienced depression would understand. And I think that's the value in it. Ultimately, while the show attempted to put a lot of ideas out there, it didn't really dig into any of them very deeply and didn't double down on exploring any of those ideas, so it ultimately didn't get a pass into one of my evaluations. I also went back and I watched The Big O, and honestly, I am a little disappointed that I'm not going to be making an episode on The Big O, because it was one of my favorite shows when I was a kid, when I was in middle school, of course, because of Toonami and watching it there. Ultimately, I'm going to blame it on the very sordid production history of the show. They had to wrap things up in the middle of the series in a very haphazard way because they didn't know that they were going to be able to continue because they had pretty much used all of their funding and had all kinds of production problems. Adult Swim actually came in and funded the rest of the show because fans in the US liked it so much. But then the show felt like it had to sort of reevaluate, re-represent all of its different metaphors, and that made the main problem that happened in the show. They had too many metaphors, but didn't really engage with what any of the metaphors meant or were trying to talk about. The central concept of the show of what is a memory and what memory means to humans was answered in multiple different and conflicting ways. It could never reach a consistent answer for its core conceit of what is a memory and what do memories mean to human beings. And it also underutilized the characters that were there to be talking heads for that subject, such as Schwarzwald or Beck, because they decided to give them partial memories that ultimately made them wrong about what memories were, rather than giving them parts of the truth. They were just plain wrong about what memories were, which means a lot of time was wasted not knowing rather than gradually building to an answer. Ultimately, the show concluded that memory is a very transient, impermanent thing that only exists in the human form, and we'll just ignore the animal aspects of that discussion. But its main focus was that memories do not define who people are. They are a part of them, but people are not defined by them, and it asserts Jean-Paul Sartre's radical freedom at the end to be that which defines the human person, the freedom of choice. And memory is an aspect of that, but not the whole aspect, not the defining aspect. I really can't say enough how much I actually love this show, though. So if you haven't watched The Big O, please watch The Big O. It also has my absolute favorite Kudere archetype character with Dorothy the android. She's the best. She was one of this one's little early waifus before he decided he didn't want to do waifu culture anymore. And he also decided to speak in the third person. Fuck him. Lastly, and certainly least, I watched Yuri Kuma Arashi. And that show is dumb. It is so dumb. It is ridiculous. It's not a bad show. It's just really dumb. Because the premise is that some aliens showed up and they were bears, and the bears are invisible and they eat humans, and a wall was separated between the humans and the bears, and also everyone who's a human is also a lesbian, and eating humans, the bears eating humans, was a metaphor for love. And it was, I don't know, I fell into a hole where the presentation was so remarkably dumb. Like, it's the kind of comedy that is purposefully dumb at you for so long that you have to laugh at it because of how ridiculous it is. Even barely getting into how whenever they wanted to surprise you with someone being a bear, the background music would just yell, "Kumashak! Kumashak!" Like bear shock. That's the word. Bear shock. And it's like, okay, I'm shocked. You're a bear. Does that mean you're a lesbian too? Yes. Yes, it does mean that. And then they also had this weird court thing where they would have to decide whether or not someone could be allowed to go do the bear thing of eat people based on whether or not it was sexy enough. And it always was. They always said yes. For pretty much every single one of those court scenes was the exact carbon copy. As much as I really want to rain on this show and talk about how bad it was, I can't, because the show actually turned out to have a really good and concise message, which is unbelievable to me. And I really hate myself for having seen it, because I would rather just insult the show, even though I liked it. It ultimately engaged with a message of accepting yourself and accepting your identity as a homosexual person in the context of Japan, where the punishment for essentially being gay is being treated like you don't exist, being ignored as a real part of society. A lot of Japanese people, even today, don't even believe that being gay is real. They still think of being homosexual as a phase or a weird fetish. And that is something that needs to change, because Japan has a lot of different points of accepting points of homosexuality that we don't here in the United States. But they also have a lot of dismissiveness. And the way that the show expressed this is that the punishment for interacting with bears, aka being gay, because everything was a metaphor for being a lesbian in this show, was the invisible storm, which was actually just a bunch of girls on their cell phones shunning people so that no one would talk to them or interact with them, and thus they would become invisible. Whereas the bears, when they talk about the bears becoming invisible, they mean literally the bears are going to be invisible. So the metaphors were hard to keep track of, and they were dumb, but they were consistent. So if you want a really stupid show about accepting homosexual love as true love, I really should recommend that you watch Yuri Kuma Arashi. And I hate that I have to say that, because I bet there are better shows about accepting homosexuality out there. In fact, I just started watching Yuri on Ice, so maybe watch Yuri on Ice instead? I don't know, man. But that's what I have. Those are the shows that I watched over the past few weeks, and unfortunately, none of them fully panned out to being able to make a good video on them. So I just wanted to run through them and tell you about it. I don't have anything else to say, so I'll go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. If you enjoyed the video, do all the YouTube things, hit the buttons down there, especially the like button so that this video can get in front of other interested people, and the subscribe button so you can see regular evaluations and things that are more focused on exposing a philosophical influence rather than just talking about not quite hitting the mark. I will see you next time, and as always, stay true.